This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
Finding inspiration in the local and the near at hand, attentive to climate concern and global unrest, to home and homelessness, belonging and welcome. On today's episode, we talk to poet and publisher Pat Boran about his 8th collection of poems, Hedge School.
Beyond the hedge at the end of our garden, the wild lands. Donkeys and cows, foxes and badgers. While us poor townies made do with cats and dogs, pigeons, and now and then the occasional rat that ran like a blur, like a shiver, up the spine between one old shed and another. Between a sack of new potatoes and a stack of drying turf or wood. Like the one that someone, I can't remember who, was said to have severed with the blade of a spade. In my mind's eye, a budding Cuchulainn, the dead rat's skin-hinged corpse, held aloft like a prize on his weapon's bleeding edge. And afterwards, as if into the fires of hell or the blank space at the margins of a map, was tossed back out over our flowering hedge.
Oh, well done. And that was Pat Boran reading his poem Beyond the Hedge from his new collection, Hedge School, published at the end of last year. And indeed, it was a great launch at the project in Temple Bar, Dublin. Well, Pat Boran is a man of many talents. He's an award-winning poet, writer, an editor, publisher of Daedalus Press. He's also an award-winning filmmaker, and he's published over 12 books of poetry and prose. Pat's distinctions include the Patrick Kavanagh Award and the US-based Lawrence O'Shaughnessy Poetry Award. He's a member of Aosdána, the Irish Affiliation of Creative Artists, and Pat lives in Dublin, but he hails from Portlaoise.
So, Pat, you're very welcome to the breakfast table.
Thanks, Enda and Peter. Good to be here.
Just listening, Pat, to your poem there, I was thinking of how your hometown is kind of is somewhere you go back to a lot in the work. I know you've written a humorous kind of prose memoir, The Invisible Prison, scenes from an Irish childhood about growing up in Portlaoise, during the 60s and 70s. But in the poems too, Portlaoise, your family experiences growing up there, they're very much present there as well. Thinking of a poem like My Mother's Books in this new collection, Hedge School, The High Window, which harks back to your father's joinery. And I know your dad ran a travel agency called Airborne, a kind of play on the surname. But what was it like to grow up there, and what is it that draws your imagination back there?
Well, I suppose, like a lot of poets particularly, but maybe writers in general, I'm paying the rent still for the period of relative freedom that I had at that stage, the early stage of my life. I mean, I lived in Portlaoise for approximately the period coming to adulthood, up to about 18 till I left school. But I think that that investment of the town in me and me in the town, those formative years are not something you walk away from. They are the base by which everything is measured afterwards. They're also conveniently a narrative that's given to you, given to me, that is sealed, done and delivered and over. And so therefore can be rediscovered and interrogated and corrupted and faked and manipulated in all the ways that one wants to do and needs to do to make something new out of experience. I think it's very hard, although there's an attempt maybe in other parts of this book, in fact in a lot of this book, to write very close to the here and now. But I think most of the time there's an element of Wordsworth's poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. There's not a lot of tranquility in my life, I have to say, but there's quite a bit of recollection, let's say.
Kind of sit on that. I mean, were kind of language and books very much part of that childhood? You know, did you always want to be a writer and a poet?
No, my mother at a stage before I was born had shown a strong interest in working in the local library, and it didn't work out, and she ended up working in Odlum's Mills in the town, which was then, before the prison became the number one employer, it was the big employer in this, you know, relatively small country town at the crossroads of the country. But there was a very strong, in my wider family, there was a very strong respect, you might say, for the book, because of the 14 members of my father's family, there were 4 nuns, there was 2 priests, there was a monk, and there was 2 other members who had gone to sign up to be Christian brothers and didn't finish. So, in fact, and I was surprised to discover as I went along and got to know them as adults, their reading wasn't all by any means religious, but it made the book part of their lives, where some of their other family members who had more, let's say, more outdoor lives, you know, the ones that stayed on the farm or the ones that did other things like that, had more kind of engaged physical lives, didn't have the time and space to reflect and didn't read in general. So I did become aware that reading was one of the side effects of a life devoted to higher things. And I think we often forget that here when we try to imagine that there's a clear division between church and state and all of that. You know, there's for all the bad things that happened and huge amount of bad things that happened in the religious run schools here, I think in some ways without them, we'd all be dragging our knuckles around the place, and there'd be very little agreement on what are the great poems of the Irish canon, etc., because there'd be no discussion at all about it, I think.
Well, that's interesting. It's interesting about your ecclesiastical history as well, Pat. I never knew that. The things you learn on this podcast. I have suffered,
I suppose you could say. Yeah.
Anyway, there's a poetry anthology on my shelf called 12 Bar Blues. It's published by Raven Arts Press in 1990. Dermot Bulger had published 12 emerging young poets, yourself and me. We were both in them. I don't even know if that's correct grammar. It's too early in the morning. But I remember first meeting you at that launch of 12 Bar Blues at the Winding Star Bookshop all those years ago. And even back then, Pat, you had huge energy and commitment to poetry. You'd come to Dublin from the Midlands, and it was kind of post-punk time, I suppose, and you'd busked for a while. You'd worked in Poetry Ireland for a time. You'd also befriended a very lively and gifted literary bunch, poets and writers like Dermot Healy and Leland Bardwell, whose flat actually you lived in York Street, didn't you, where you met many poets and writers.
I did. I went to Grogan's one day to follow up an ad in the Irish press, or to read up ads in the Irish press, I should say, looking for a flat. And I found myself sitting beside this woman that I'd met a couple of times before, Leland Bardwell. And she was waiting for somebody to come to take keys for her place. And as we imbibed some refreshments, the deal was done. And for nearly 4 years, I think, I found myself then living in her place. And so that was kind of part of my entry into that whole madness, really.
Yeah, because you met so many writers there. It must have been great you were beginning to write. It must have been brilliant for you to arrive in Dublin. How lucky to meet Leland.
Yeah, I kind of regret in some ways that I got it, the way you do, that I got distracted into other things in the intervening years, because there was a great memoir while I still remembered what was going on to be written there. The end of a kind of an era of the 1950s, 60s literary Dublin, people like John Jordan and all of those, and a kind of a chaos that seemed to be around them, even though individually all of them were very, very focused, but their lives were chaotic, and partly because, and not glamorously chaotic. I'm not trying to paint this as boho Dublin or something. They were haunted by poverty. A lot of them. They were haunted by the insecurity of not knowing where they were going to be living from one minute to the next, and yet they were making books and poems and stories and novels and plays as if their lives depended on it, Yeah,
an amazing bunch.
Quite amazing, really, yeah.
Just to turn, Pat, to the new book of poems, I mean, the title is Hedge School, and the idea of hedges runs throughout the collection. I'm thinking like in Haggard, of sparrows, you write, Once more back to the hedge, that neighbour of difference, of otherness, that place where town meets country, here meets elsewhere, where outside peers in the dead of night. And we're also told in the poem Summer in Baldoyle, 2 centuries back, Samuel Lewis, in his topical dictionary of Ireland, recorded 12 children attending a hedge school in Baldoyle, where you live. And I was just wondering, hedges and the worlds they hold and hide, their kind of symbolic and historical significance are a persistent motif in this collection. They really fascinate you, don't they?
Yeah, I think, you know, as someone who fell into, very much by accident, who fell into publishing and being a publisher in a somewhat inebriated exchange that happened in a pub one night at a reading. A publisher said, "I'm fed up with this," and I said, like Yasser Hughes in The Boys and the Black Stuff, I can do that with all the arrogance of youth, and suddenly I'm doing it. But one of the things I start to feel afterwards, having produced a lot of books with other people, and you hope you learn something from it. I'm not sure what I did, but I think one of the things I'm guessing is that a book is a unit. It can be, and this is not to denigrate works that are made like this, it can just be a collection of poems that was written between the year X and the year Y. And many books are like that, and they are just an anthology, a gathering of flowers. But I think every now and then, to think of a book as being about something is very useful, particularly if you're like me and you make an awful lot of stuff. I just produce a lot of crap. And so I end up having the problem of how do I know what fits in? And I used to have the time to think about that. Now I have no time. So I do everything badly, maybe, but I do everything once and on an impulse. So with this book, I had about 500 poems. I probably put the 496 good ones. I've probably left them out. But what I did was I said, well, what's the book about? And go through it and start noticing things and then build around that. So that idea of the literal hedge that was at the back of our garden as kids, beyond which was the wild lands that I just talked about, when Portlaoise was still a kind of a country town as opposed to a satellite of Dublin. And then the hedge here outside the house I'm sitting in now in North Dublin, which we planted, myself and my wife and a few friends and a couple of local kids. We planted it within weeks of buying this house in 2000 when we moved out here. And in a way, that kind of circling of the wagons, as I see it, around the house, and the way the houses here are circled like wagons around a common green, all of those things kind of became symbolic for how you establish a house, how you decide what's in and what's out, how you leave a little bit of movement, how the wall itself, Pache, Mr. Trump, is a living thing and has to allow movement in both directions. So all of those kind of, what would you might say, thematic ideas are all there in the background. But I try generally not to think too much about what the poems are about in that kind of global sense, and just concentrate on the mechanics, the kind of the video of the poem. Can I see it? Are all the parts present and correct insofar as I can get them present and correct? Because often it's only afterwards I kind of figure out what the poem is about. As I say, I would love to be one of those poets of yore, if they ever existed, who can sit out on a sun lounger all day and contemplate my navel. But I tend to do it really fast. And in fact, a lot of the poems in this book were just, for better or worse, were just written on my phone while walking the dog. And I'd speak them into the phone and then I'd forget them. And when it came to making the book, I go, oh, Jesus, it's just too many and I don't know what this is about. And just start trying to see what they would be like putting them together. And on another day, it would be an entirely different book. That's to be honest.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that. There's a great natural flow to the collection, I think, but it's also about the natural world. I mean, you were talking there about hedges. I'm thinking of a poem, New Homes, which we're hoping that you'll read later, where you say, while to each new horror, each growing threat, the birds say, no, not now, not like this, not yet. And then I was also drawn to a poem like Building the Ark, where you say, it's not that Noah saves the animals, but that the animals as ever save the man. So do you think, Pat, that we don't pay enough attention to the natural world and what we can learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hedge. Look, it's a hedge school in the sense that I'm not the teacher. Yeah. I think all these poems are kind of, in the widest possible sense, they are didactic. I picked them because I think each one has, an old-fashioned thing, but has a message, has something to tell me beyond itself. I don't think it's enough with the world about to end in half an hour. Maybe not for me, but for lots of people I know and that we know in the next year, in the next 2 years. I kind of don't think it's enough to just take things that I've written and say, now I'm going to publish them. I think I choose them because I think they mean more outside of my personal narrative. So I think one of the things in these poems is the importance of interruption, the importance of not being in control, the importance of, oh, look at that, there are a number of poems. There were a huge number of them, but there's a few of them just to keep that flavour for myself, where birds just come in, or pigeons shit on my head, or whatever. It's just those kind of interruptions that literally bring you back down to earth, that earth you again. Or there's a poem where I was taking a walk one day up in Howth, and suddenly I found myself surrounded by goats, and the dog was, and just that moment of being outside, I was the one in control. I was going there to photograph the landscape. I had all this plan in my head, and actually I came back with a completely different poem where I was as close to irrelevant as possible. So I think that's kind of what's going on in the poems, and the birds in that sense are they've always been messengers. The history of literature is about the birds coming from the Bible to elsewhere, but they're also useful interruptions. Would you ever get on out of that or come out here, and have a look at me?
I remember once I was doing an interview for radio once, and a bird shot on my head. In Whitefriars Street, as I was doing the radio, so I had to do the rest of the radio interview covered in bird.
Now you know why they're called Whitefriars.
Yeah, exactly. So now why it's called Whitefriars Street. But going back, I mean, because what you were saying there about the kind of interruption, and it's kind of like, because there's that movement away from the personal as well. I mean, there's poems about, there's kind of global anxiety and climate change, and there's upheaval like in the world that you also register, like on the morning news. Stories of the Taliban closing schools, depriving girls of education, like you say in a poem like penal laws. And as against that, there's the poems that are very much rooted in the local, like as you're kind of suggesting there, the kind of detailed, kind of tiny but interesting observations of the steadfast little bird about her business in the title poem, Hedge School. What's she at out back? That little bag of chirps, small beak, hole poking, feather stroking, nitpicking. So it's kind of like a kind of a balance of the local and the global. And I suppose, is that something as well that kind of just happened organically?
That's one of the things, I suppose, that happens when you accumulate, when you're writing and you start to accumulate things. You see patterns, but you also start to see the interruptions to the pattern. So it would be perverse, I think, especially in our gloriously, in inverted commas, connected age, to make a book that was only about the local. Even though since the beginning of COVID, when I started making short poetry films in my confined radius and saying, well, what can I do? What can I actually do when I go out? And that's extended to these poems. But the danger, of course, of deifying the local is that it can seem like rejection of everything that's just beyond the local. My parish is better than your parish. My team are going to come and crack heads in yours, So but I think even if one wanted to do that, which I certainly don't, and that's not the purpose, to establish a green and pleasant land, but it's to say that even when we focus or try to focus back on the local, in fact, by doing so, we connect more than we ever did to the global, to the shared experience of the horrors of living in the 21st century. That it's not about separation, but it is about making meaningful those connections. Because if we go for a kind of a world music in poetry or in anything else, we end up not earthing anywhere. One of my, it may be my only real connection with the world in the last couple of weeks, because I'm in a period of kind of intense editing, and I don't see much of the world. But when I go out for a walk with the dog, I have a script, in a sense, in my head. I interrogate everybody I meet now. I won't come home until I have some kind of a meaningful conversation with somebody. Usually I use their dog as a way in, or their dog or my dog, or, the way you do the small talk. But the small talk is a door opening. And I think in that sense, a lot of these poems are that kind of small talk. They're attempting to go through something that's local and small and specific and by necessity limited, but trying to get to something that's a bigger truth in itself without sounding too ambitious.
Well, actually, that's great to hear back, because that actually was something I really thought about when I was reading this book. It is a meditative poetry, but it's also poetry that looks outwards to people. Neighbours Make a Neighbourhood is one poem about a neighbour, Jamie Skipper-Moore, who dies. And there's encounters along the way with people you meet. I'm thinking of one in the United States, this poem called Missing Children. You're very much a poet who's inspired by human life. You're always on the listen out for other people's stories, remembering stories, conversations. And I think there's a strong social conscience there as well. And I was wondering about your poem Beggar, actually, which addresses homelessness. And could you perhaps read it for us, lead us into it and read it?
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of do it the head over heels. Maybe I'll read it first.
Yeah, that'd be lovely. Yeah, that would be lovely.
Just not to kind of preempt it in a way, because it's a kind of prosy poem as well, and it's a poem that happened. Not all poems do. You shouldn't always believe what poets tell you, of course. But anyway, Beggar. He tells me he is trying to get to Mayo, on the far side of the country. This scar-faced, drink-stinking, bloodshot-eyed beggar who approaches the table with an outstretched hand. Patrons stiffen, check or straighten bags, scan the footpath for a waiter or a bouncer. He tries to look me in the eye but struggles to focus. He's my age, maybe younger, but I feel like a boy against his lifetime of pain and graft. I chance a smile, and when he scowls back in confusion like an angry dog that fails to conjure fear, without thinking, lightly, I touch him on the arm, and when he doesn't shake me off, just stares, my hand settles on his shoulder. I cannot help myself. Now we lean in close together like strangers meeting in a clearing in a jungle. Are you sleeping rough? I ask, with the privilege of one who is not. He nods wordlessly. That's a tough gig. His boxer's nose might be metallic in its leathery, sunburned pouch of skin. Like, and now I see it, see him, the bogman in the National Museum around the corner, his eyes trapped behind the moment's cabinet glass. I give him a note and coins I see he scarcely remembers asking for. He grips them in a giant bare-knuckled fist, and not a word of thanks, no salutation of one brother to another, not so much as a grunt. He is moving, sloping off, a man who has been to the edge of the known, and in a clearing met and was touched by a ghost.
So that, Pat, it was lovely to hear, wasn't it, Peter?
Yeah, great.
That, I when I came upon that poem afterwards, it reminded me of a documentary I saw. I suppose when I was a kid, so probably back in Portlaoise pre-Leaving Cert, of early, if not first, contacts with the Yanomami Indians in the Amazon jungle, and their kind of disbelief at meeting these straw hat covered white men just suddenly stepping out into a clearing, and that was the feeling I had. Like we meet the settled, or the homed. We meet the homeless all the time, but in some ways we never meet them. We never see ourselves through their eyes, which is what brings us to literature in the first place. That we want experience, but we don't always want it from the point of view that we were born into, luckily or unluckily. We want to go on a trip, if you like, and I think just in this particular time where there are so many forces dividing us from each other and making tribes of us, I just have found myself in the last, as I say, kind of 4 or 5 years, being really alert to those little encounters, to the small things people say to me really get into my head now and dwell on my mind, and not just that they are, but for the grace of God, encounters that we have and should have when we meet people worse off than ourselves, but the kind of world-changing perspective that sometimes meeting somebody like that can bring.
I mean, also, I think there's a huge kind of visual energy to the poem as well. We're actually there with you. We can see it. And does this kind of translates as well? Because I did want to ask you before you go about your films as well. There's a lot of poems in the book. Building an Ark was made at the Tree of Life, St. Anne's Park. The Statues of Emo was commissioned by Donamesa Arts Centre. Out of the Blue was commissioned by Fingal Poetry Festival. So you've poems in this book which are also parts of poetry films that you've been making. You're talking there about going out into the world and watching everything closely and encountering people. But you must have got a great buzz out of making these poetry films. How did they come about? Did it all start in lockdown?
Yeah, it did all start in lockdown. They kind of work differently, but to answer kind of the second part of the question first, I pulled my back and I was in bed playing with my phone, which is what we all do. And I started to feel guilty. Just at the start of lockdown, that I was now joining the legions of consumers, and I'm arrogant enough to think I'm a producer. I'm not a consumer, or I try to balance the two, try to produce everything, and I wasn't producing anything. So I started kind of fiddling around with a bit of software, the way maybe you did with podcasting equipment, and you think, well, I could actually I could make something with this. There's no excuse anymore in that sense. And then when I started moving around, it was just an opportunity or an excuse to try and do things on the hoof. And the poems that come from it, in general, not always, the ones that are made while the film is being made, they tend to be looser, and I'm unapologetic about that. They're not really book poems in some ways, though some of them are in this book, and they will feel looser than other poems. I don't care. I mean, I'm not trying to make something homogenous, that every poem is built on the same impulse or the same mechanic. History will decide whether they're good or bad. I genuinely kind of don't really care. But what I do care about is that they have some that they have some spark or appetite or integrity or, some draw. And the draw of them often is that while I might be taking a photo of something or a little clip on my phone, or I have a better camera maybe now, while I'm doing that, I'm also speaking my ideas out loud. I'm trying not to be in my book-lined library writing poems. I think that's a very valid way to write poems. Don't get me wrong, but I'm also attracted to lepidopterists who go out with a net and they don't know if they're going to catch anything that day, or painters who go out, and paint en plein air, put up an easel and hope that the light does what they want it to do. I think there's a lot about poetry that empathizes with that, like the haiku poets, the poets on journeys, the poets going up the side of a mountain and looking at the light changing. It's not only good for the soul, but it can catch you by surprise. But other poems I have gone back to, pre-existing poems, let's say, and thought, what happens if I added images? And recently I started making video poems that there's no pictures in, there's no images, because I realise actually, in some ways, I'm not terribly visually literate. But I have always liked audio, and I've always played music. I've always played instruments and done things like that. And I realised one of the things I like most about making the video poems is the sound of them. I really like adding and amplifying and precisely placing particular sounds or relationships between a word and an image, etc. I do like that. It kind of satisfies my, fiddling, ludic personality.
I think they're really beautiful. I love especially the statues of Emo. My heart just leaps when I get to the bit about your mother in the poem. I think it's very beautiful, Pat. So well done on all those. If anybody wants to actually see them, where can they get them, or how do they access them?
Up to about a year ago, everything new, I put it on YouTube. Of course, YouTube is not the ideal place to ask people to slow down. It's all about jump cuts and binge feeding. But I see YouTube from another angle, I suppose. I think it's a free archive online. It'll probably be there when I'm dead, and it will keep the work available for the two people who might be interested in it.
Maybe more.
So I think there's a lot. So there's a lot of reasons for us not to run away from this technology just because we don't like the bullies on it on Twitter. I'm not a Twitter person, but I will have to be dragged away from Facebook, kicking and screaming. It doesn't matter how much trash is put my way, because I do think it's an incredible technology for connecting with people and saying, I just saw this great poem by X, look at this, or here's a great painting by Y. And I think if it was taken away from us, I almost wouldn't know how to start. I'm at an age of my life where I work at a desk all day. I go for walks with the dog. I hardly get out to anything. I'm out of the country as much as I'm in. I'd really miss the connection. So I think it's a place not only to bring poems. Sometimes my new poems, I don't send them to magazines anymore. I just put them on Facebook, and that's it. I think it's the world.
Let me ask you a related question, right? Because you're a publisher. You're surrounded by floods of poetry manuscripts. Does that make it hard to read? I mean, poetry. I mean, does it change your relationship to reading poetry since you're a publisher and you have to deal with it as your work all of the time? Can you read poetry for pleasure still?
It's difficult. I mean, I'm sure you find it as well. Although you also, through the podcast, you're working with prose writers and non-fiction writers. So there's a little bit more. There's a little bit. There are parts of the garden where the grass is growing longer, let's say. But it doesn't put me off the reading, but it makes it very difficult to write, which probably is what I'm on the run from when I'm out with the camera or with a little microphone on my lapel having a wobbly. But at the same time, I remember going to Sicily, where my wife is from, about 15 years ago via a change of flight in Milan. And it was around the time that headsets, Bluetooth headsets were starting to be popular. So, of course, the Italians got on board first. And every businessman and woman in pinstripe and whatever in the airport was having these heated conversations with invisible people and gesticulating crazily because their bodies could not be part of these conversations. And it just really, really struck me that, when you shift to another gear, you bring some things with you. The body has to get involved. So I've always found that sitting at the desk, I can't judge other people's poems very well if I'm just in the role of a poetry editor. And writing my own poems, I find it almost impossible to tell if they're good or bad when it wants to get to a screen, because the screen has a certain authority. And a lot of the really, really terrible poems I get as an editor are was it Truman Capote said it, are typing, not writing of, that they have that kind of solidity about them. You're looking for a voice that you can trust, that you can go with. And it doesn't have to be the eye of the look, I'm talking to two poets, so you know what I'm saying, but I'm talking to myself as well. It does the autobiographical element is often the impulse to get going. To go back to Peter's original question about childhood and why so many poets maybe go back to early years, etc., because it's accumulated and they have an angle on it. But in the end, you can't judge the poetry by the autobiography. It has to be bigger or different or other than the autobiography. The autobiography is just a start, in the same way that the walk is just a start. It's just to get you moving and, to get you something to work with, a palette of colours, literally that.
Yeah, well, Pat, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. And we're not going to let you go without reading another poem. Actually, just listening to you there, I really feel like not putting on the coffee after this, Peter. We're going out and having a good old walk with the dog. But the last poem that we'd love to hear is New Homes, which we mentioned previously, and it's one of my personal favourite poems in the book, from Hedge School, published by Daedalus Press. And details of this book will be available on booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com and all the usual outlets. So we're going to finish up, say thank you very much to Pat Boran, and we are going to hear New Homes. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks a million, and Peter. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun to have you here, Pat. Thanks for coming in. Yeehaw.
The revolution begins now. Okay.
Exactly.
New homes. New homes are being built from scratch, in days or hours, in garden hedgerows, in rotten fencing, under the eaves or in a stack of oil-black bamboo rods left out since last year in all weathers. In Turkey, in Syria, people like us are on their knees in the perishing cold, hammering, digging, holding their breaths, listening for the signs of movement in the rubble that used to be their lives. I can scarcely watch. And here, mere feet from my garden bench, a wave, a blur, a shoal of small dark forms comes winging in, whirring, tumbling through the air, life's effervescence, soon to build a whole new glorious city from the debris of the old. Make no mistake, the world is cruel and beautiful in equal part. So what to do? I write and give up writing, and write again and again give up, while to each new horror, each growing threat, the birds say, no, not now, not like this, not yet.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sarah here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.